in fantasy football, Nico Collins, Brandon Ayuk are guys that are going in the second round of your fantasy drafts. You're going to see this as a common trend this offseason, as the second round is just completely garbage, honestly, this year. Like, I have no idea who to take. Yeah. But there are particular red flags with Nico Collins and Brandon Ayuk both that we should talk about in this video. Because when you're talking about the amount of targets that they get, and targets are important for fantasy football. If you're playing in half PPR or full PPR leagues, you're talking about receptions being the primary means in which wide receivers are actually scoring fantasy points, right? And so because of that, the most important and telling statistic where there is almost a direct correlation between the two statistics in terms of scoring fantasy points, that statistic is targets. Okay? And so targets is something that we look at, and we can say confidently if somebody gets 130 plus targets, they're outscoring somebody that gets 110 targets. Marginal difference, 20 targets, almost always is true. You see that in this graph here that shows that there is a close to 1-to-1 correlation between targets and fantasy points as a trend. And so when you're looking at Nico Collins, and typically guys that score in the wide receiver 1 range as a wide receiver 1 are getting a lot of targets. Let's even look down the list here and targets versus fantasy finish into this graph here. Now, the number 1 guy on this list is scoring, 181 targets, 172 targets, 164 targets, 158, 157. And then we drop down 130, 135, 160, 150, 176. And then eventually you go way down here. Where is he at? To 109 targets. You're talking about the minimum of the top 12 wide receivers in fantasy football last year having 135 to 138 targets, and Nico Collins has 21 less targets than those guys.
That's a lot. That's a lot of targets.
And basically, we want to start off by saying for Nico Collins especially, when you have that level of production with that little targets, typically what you see is that it's not sustainable. The best example that we have of this that we've referenced in a Dynasty video we did with some similar data here is Jalen Waddle. The only guy that had the yards per reception, fantasy points per target, and touchdowns above the thresholds that Nico does this year was Jalen Waddle in 2022. And what did you see from Jalen Waddle?
Severe regression.
Extreme regression. On an efficiency-adjusted basis. Not just like he played less games, he scored less points. His fantasy production on a per-game basis dropped. Half a point per game. Not to mention, not scoring as many touchdowns and not being on the field as much. He was really the only other guy in recent history to do this at this level with this amount of targets and score as a wide receiver 1, and next year he was not close. For Nico would have to maintain this level of efficiency. So I'm talking about he would have to maintain 2.5 fantasy points per target, 16 yards per reception, 8 touchdowns. All of those are not very sustainable metrics when you're looking at them in the context of guys around this target range. And so for Nico this year, what he would basically, he would either have to be a serious outlier again with Stephon Diggs coming into the offense. We haven't even talked about that. With Tank Dell hopefully being healthy a full year. Yeah. With Dalton Schultz still there. With now Joe Mixon, a better pass-catching back than what they've had there. It's similar to Devin Singletary, but probably a slight upgrade. And you would basically have to bet for Nico Collins to be worth it at his current price in fantasy that he's going to be an outlier from the target perspective versus production again.
Yeah, I do think this is interesting. All of the wide receivers in this ADP range in the second round of your fantasy drafts right now they're all kind of dealing with the same situation. They're all kind of dealing with the same amount of targets. So luckily, targets aren't everything in this data that we found. Targets are not the only deciding factor for what is and isn't sustainable for these types of wide receivers because there is a decent amount of them. But I'm looking at Drake London going in the second round. I'm looking at Ayuk going in the second round. Chris Olave even, who had, like 120 plus targets, I think, but nothing like insane. Devontae Adams, the huge outlier here, which I can just pause here. Take Devontae Adams in the second round.
Yes.
Take Devontae Adams. Please. He had 70 targets last year.
Talk about outliers. Devontae Adams on this graph is that big high spike. Highlight it somehow, Luke, even if you just hover over it. He was an outlier the opposite way as much as Nico Collins was for scoring as many points as he did with as little targets as he had.
And that's more sustainable. So that was kind of just a side note there. But all the wide receivers here, London, Ayuk, Collins, Waddle. Heck, even Debo, because he doesn't get a ton of targets either. Yep. Mike Evans had 130 targets last year, so that's pretty good. Olave. But that cluster of wide receivers there, which ones are the ones that we would take a shot on in this range? And we are going to determine that by this data that we pulled, which is not just the targets. There are basically three elements here. If you have this range of targets, if you have like 100 to 110 targets that you got in 2023, what other metrics do you have to showcase to prove that not only is your current production in 2023 sustainable, but you also have upside to increase that production in 2024? So those metrics are yards per reception, right? That's what are you doing with the catches that you're getting in the offense? Because if you're...
And how are you being used?
And how are you being utilized? Yeah, are you exclusively slot? Are you versatile? Are you just on the outside? So you require a lot of big playability and stuff like that. Fantasy points per target is the second statistic here. So that's pretty all-encompassing, right? That's what are you getting with every... Are you making the most out of every single target that you're getting? Are you being forced to make the most out of every single target that you're getting? Or is there some leeway there because you're getting a decent amount of targets? Spoiler alert, there's not going to be a lot of leeway with a lot of these receivers because their targets are already limited.
Right.
Touchdowns is the other one. You hear people talk about touchdowns and how volatile those are, and we'll touch on touchdowns a little bit here, but you kind of know the story there. You know that touchdowns are volatile. You know that if someone scores 10 touchdowns, that's not going to be as sustainable as someone scoring 5. And that's just a reality. I don't think anyone's going to deny that one here. And there are some notable touchdown discrepancies here in this data that would lead us to believe that something else is going to have to give in one of those other three metrics for them to sustain this production. I'll start with touchdowns because it's the easiest. Jordan Addison is a screaming one here. Jordan Addison had 10 touchdowns, well over what everyone else in this target range had. He ended up producing as a wide receiver 23. With 10 touchdowns, he was only the wide receiver 23.
What's he going to do when he scores 5 touchdowns?
He's going to have to up those targets, and he's going to have to up that yardage, what he does with those targets and receptions. And honestly, with a downgrade at the quarterback position, it's a downgrade from going from Kirk Cousins to J.J. McCarthy because he's unproven, and he's going to have to develop. Doesn't mean his upside in the future isn't going to be higher, but when you're looking at 2024 in Jordan Addison's production, what's it going to be? Probably low. I would probably bet on it being lower than it was his rookie season. His ADP right now is currently wide receiver 39, which again isn't super unreasonable. I think a lot of you guys are kind of accounting for that drop in production because he's going around some of those unproven rookies in Lab McConkey and Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas D-Hop, but Kamara going in that range, Kenneth Walker, George Kittle, those kinds of guys. So again, not out of this world, but keep that in mind. If you're wondering why is Jordan Addison going in that range, that's the reason why. That is the one big red flag there.
And you look at the touchdown dependency rate, which I calculated as just the ratio of the points scored from touchdowns and the points overall scored in full PPR leagues last year. Jordan Addison, of the players in this target range, 100 to 115 targets here, has the highest touchdown dependency rate. It's 0.27, so 27% of Jordan Addison's fantasy points last year came from touchdowns. That's a lot. And typically, again, with it being as volatile of a statistic as it is, we typically try to avoid those guys if their price is anywhere similar to what it was last year. But that being said, he finishes the wide receiver 24. He's being drafted right now as the wide receiver 39. There's a discount baked in there. It makes Jordan Addison a less risky pick. It doesn't mean, though, that we're going to go draft Jordan Addison everywhere at that price. No. I'll let you make your own assumptions as to whether you want to draft Jordan Addison or not. I think the 15 spot difference there between where he finished last year and where he's being drafted this year, I think it's warranted. I honestly think it could be bigger than that, potentially, with the downgrade at QB like you mentioned. It's hard to say. I mean, when you're looking at some of this touchdown dependency also, Nico Collins had almost 0.18, so 18% of his production came from touchdowns. When you're looking at Rashee Rice, 20%.
You want to see about 10%. 10% is what makes you comfortable.
That's like elite. And so like the guys that have 10% here, really less are Drake London had 7% of his production come from touchdowns last year. And Drake London, he was in the 30s last year from a production standpoint.
Jalen Waddle, 12%, right? So that's a little bit, again, that's more sustainable, which is why his production went down compared to 2022.
Yeah.
But there is another important metric here, and that is the yards per reception. And this is probably the biggest one to focus on because honestly, there is there is a pretty direct correlation once you get past a certain threshold when you're looking at yards per reception where you can be pretty confident that in future years, that's going to go down. And that's generally over 15, 16-ish yards per reception.
Yes.
On the higher end, I mean, you're seeing guys like George Pickens, 18 yards per reception. Brandon Ayuk, 17 yards per reception. Nico Collins, 16 yards per reception. They're all kind of in the red here because they're well above everyone else in this range. So what is that saying about these guys? Again, they have to get a lot of yards out of the limited opportunity that they're currently getting. And when you're looking at their price, Devontae Smith is right behind these guys. His overall ADP is like 26. Going behind Devon Achane, Mike Evans, Deebo Samuel, Waddle, Collins. And he's the cheapest one of this bunch. And he's also really the safest with the yards per reception. Right? 13 yards per reception. You're like, yeah, that's absolutely doable. You see good wide receivers consistently keep that up year after year.
Right.
You see fantasy points per target. You're like, oh, that's notably lower than your guys like Ayuk and Nico Collins. And also, I would say is pretty sustainable. 7 touchdowns. I mean, he's done it like 2 years in a row.
Yes.
is 7 touchdowns. You know what you're getting out of Devonta Smith, and that's a mid to high end wide receiver too.
Yep.
And he's probably not going to stop doing that, because he's such a perfect fit in the Eagles offense. So for me, if you're looking at this range in a cluster, which I already mentioned, I would probably pass up on the guys on the high end, like Ayuk and Collins and Waddle. And on that turn, going into the beginning of the third round, I'd probably just snag Devonta Smith there instead. Now, what's the big counter argument there? It's the upside, right? What's the upside of Ayuk and Collins compared to Devonta Smith? Well, they could be wide receiver ones in their offenses. We know that Devonta Smith isn't a wide receiver one in his offense. He's always going to be playing behind A.J. Brown.
Right.
But let me ask you, let me offer a counterpoint to that counterpoint that I just hypothetically came up with.
Sure.
And that is, when have Ayuk and Nico Collins ever actually produced target-wise as wide receiver ones? Because we already just showed you that they're outliers. 110 targets isn't going to cut it.
No.
It's not. In the efficiency metrics that they showcase are not sustainable. 2022, again, Jalen Waddle, case in point here. Red in every single metric. Yards per reception, 18. Fantasy points per target, 2.27. That's less fantasy points per target than Nico Collins and Brandon Ayuk had in 2023 by a significant margin.
Yes.
Significant. And 8 touchdowns, exact same that both of them had. So that's just an FYI. I would be targeting the targets more than I would be what you're expecting them to do in 2024, just because they looked good last year.
Yeah.
And because they had some good big playability.
And the other rookie on this list is going to be Zay Flowers, actually. And Zay Flowers, this is, I think, another takeaway from this data.
Yes.
Is that Zay Flowers is a guy that at price, what's his price again, if you could remind me?
Wide receiver 25 going by Sam Laporta, the tight end 1, right? Derrick Henry, Michael Pittman Jr., Tank Dell, who could be as low as a wide receiver 3 in his own offense. Kelsey, Higgins, Pickens, Amari Cooper.
So wide receiver 25, right?
Yeah.
Last year he finishes the wide receiver 28, 11 yards per reception, 2 fantasy points per target, and only 6 touchdowns. So a touchdown dependency rate of 17%, which is better than 25, right?
Yeah, because it's less than.
Yes, which is what you're looking for.
Maths.
A big analysis, guys. That's the kind of production that when I'm looking for guys that could potentially break out, we talked about this in our breakout videos, I'm looking at guys like Zay Flowers. Zay Flowers, you see that this production is sustainable, but not only that, he was a rookie. So this production is one you can build off of. Mm-hmm. You can build off of that yards per reception. You can build off of the efficiency. You can even score more touchdowns potentially. But it's also the fact that he's going to develop as a talent and a wide receiver. And so that when you're getting him 4th, 5th round in your fantasy drafts, he's a guy I'm going to be taking there a lot personally.
Yeah, I mean, he's the last remaining. I mean, you could argue that George Pickens is the last remaining wide receiver 1 on this list where he could be the top option in his offense, and he probably will be. But with Flowers, it's like, dude, I can get him so much cheaper than these other guys in the second round. Again, if you pass up on Ayuk or Nico Collins in the second round, if you pass up on Jalen Waddle and you try to get Devonta Smith at the turn in the third round and you miss because someone else snipes you, which happens all the time in your fantasy drafts, you're like, okay, no biggie, no sweat. I'll get the same amount of targets and opportunity from Zay Flowers in the freaking 5th round.
Absolutely.
4th round.
And again, like basically what we're trying to do, like a big part of fantasy football every year is safety in production and sustainability. And some of these guys, again, have shown that this may not be sustainable, and some of them have shown that this will be sustainable, and some of them have showed they could take steps up. And so plan accordingly. Do whatever you want with this data, but that's kind of how we interpreted it. Do us a huge favor. If you play fantasy football, make sure you drop a like on this video, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get as many subscribers as we can to grow the channel, grow the community. You can help us out by doing those two things. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching, and we will see you later.